Hello, friends, and welcome to the season finale of the CUInsight Experience. Like many of you, I am also ready to put 2020 to bed. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Trellance. Please make sure to click on their link in the show notes and give them some love. See how they are transforming data into actionable insights for credit unions from coast to coast. My name is Randy Smith. I am one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and it is my job on the show to have conversations with the best and the brightest of the credit union community. I get to pick their brains and see if we can't find a few nuggets that we can all learn from. Today's show is going to be a little bit different than normal, but I'm sure it will still be loaded with nuggets, so there is no need to worry. The idea for this episode was based on something that has become a new normal in many of our lives, our morning walks. We all seem to be doing a lot more walking this year. So we're not going to stick to the same old script as we have in past episodes of the CUInsight Experience. We'll end, I'll go with odd year we call 2020. With a little bit different experience. My guest, co-host, partner in life is back for the season finale. The one, the only, Jill Nowacki. Jill, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Oh, I think we are going to have so much fun. You know, in this episode of the CUInsight Experience, I wanted to acknowledge the year that has been, but also focus on the good that we so often overlook and look forward to 2021. At the end, I'll share some ways that the CUInsight Experience will be new and hopefully improve for 2021. So to start, I loved our morning walks. I appreciate the time that we were able to share this year and the conversations that we've had that were, just uninterrupted by phones, work, life. Something that you and I both mentioned often was how grateful we are that we share similar values. And we talked about it. It was probably a pretty tough year for folks that maybe didn't, since we're, everyone's spending so much time under the same roof with everything going on. And that kind of brings me into the first question that I wanted to pose to you. So people are under a lot of stress this year. Credit unions are made up of these people and, they're stressed too. When working with credit union leaders, have you come up with any hacks to help us all, let's just say, get along when we may have very differing opinions of the world today, but still have to live or work under the same roof?
Yeah, and this has been such an interesting year too, if I can just talk about that a little bit. We have been able to live in a situation this year where, as things have been more polarizing and more stressful and more difficult, many of us have really been in situations where we've withdrawn a lot from other social situations. So we haven't, with social distancing, we've established these little tribal pods that we've spent time with. We haven't traveled to different places. We haven't seen extended family as much. And then just the way the world is right now, too, you can find a news source that tells you what you want to hear in a lot of cases. So what remains, though, is the workplace, where millions of Americans still go to work and still have to interact meaningfully with whoever happens to be there. And they don't get to choose that audience or those interactions. So very important that, maybe more important than anywhere else in our lives, that we really do look at how to get along at work. And it's not easy when so much of the rest of your life, you don't have to get along. You can choose to stop following or stop friending people and move that way. But at work, it's important to make sure you're really looking at how to have conversations that maybe do separate a person from a position and move forward with empathy and understanding in that way instead.
So this to me has to be let's say maybe it's tricky. Like if you were talking to a leader out there, maybe you're talking to a fellow CEO, the idea that you want people to bring their whole selves to work, as you've mentioned on previous episodes of the podcast, and yet the whole selves might create some conflict in this current environment. Is there any, I guess, how do you walk that tightrope if you were talking to, say, one of the CEOs that you work with?
Yep. So I feel like in some ways there's kind of like a hill you have to get over.
Okay.
So you start out and when you're not bringing your whole self to work, you're maybe assimilating, you might be hiding certain parts of yourself or masking certain parts of yourselves. And if you're confused, you might come into a situation and say, well, I'm afraid that I can't say anything right, so I'm just not going to say anything at all. And that's a sort of point of people saying, well, we won't talk about politics and religions at work. We won't talk about these important things at work. And we want to just have a politically correct environment. But on the other side of that hill is a place where you can be authentically inclusive. You can be curious about people who think differently, and you can go to that and get in those conversations from a place of understanding your own awareness of what you think and what you feel, and see that as your own perspective, but also identify that there's value in the perspectives and values that someone else believes. So between that place of political correctness and authentic inclusion is a giant mountain you have to climb, though. and that mountain is what I tell leaders to do the work to try to get over. So build that internal personal understanding first. Get to know, be curious about why you think the way you do. So if you feel offended because somebody voted for a different person for president than you did, go deep into why that is. Is it truly that that person is a horrible person, or do you feel some sort of personal value that may be violated, that when you deeply explore that value and then also stop and understand what that other person values, can you find a place of common ground in there that you can still see the other person as being a valuable human to work alongside?
That is good stuff. This fall I was listening to you practice for a keynote that you were going to be giving. I believe it was to our friend Brett Martinez's credit union, Redwood out in California, virtually, of course. How could I not hear you since we're, under the same place all the time? But in it, you were talking about, taking, these times that we're in. I remember the conversation we were having as you were trying to put it together about, you can't just sugarcoat over what this year has been and act like, hey, rah, 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 without acknowledging it, but I was so impressed listening to you practicing and it was so, it really did move me, but it was that idea of finding the joy that still exists kind of in those tough moments. And I completely am paraphrasing because it was kind of what I took from listening to you. And then also that point when we look back on things, like the things that I think we tend to remember about those tough times once they're past and kind of into the memory, which this year isn't yet. But I would love if you could share with our listeners, maybe what you learned putting that together and, what came to light when you were kind of trying to motivate people, I guess, because that was the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I just think it's really important that we point out all the free consulting hours you've really gotten this year, right?
Amazing. That's right. Yeah. We live in consulting.
You get to hear keynote speeches. You get to hear goodbyes. It is some close quarters here in COVID.
The CUInsight and Humanity home offices, right? And a fourth grade classroom much of the time. So.
Oh, it's no more open floor plans after this. But to answer your question, though, that talk that I gave for Redwood's All Staff Day was one of my favorite elements to really put together this year. And what I kept going back to in the conversations I had with their leadership team as we were designing the day and designing the session is that they were talking about how we recognize that people are moving through this marathon right now. And we need to find messaging for our employees and our teams that keep them motivated during this slog. And so I was trying to figure out, gosh, what have I done that feels like this hard thing or this difficult thing? And because so many people keep on comparing 2020 to a marathon, it did make me think of the marathons that I have run. And specifically, the year that I ran the Boston Marathon was a really hot year, and it was just a really miserable experience. And so when I look back on it today, though, I don't look back on it and say, okay, that's not true. I do look back on it and say that was really hard. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I can recognize that it wasn't 26.2 miles of hard. There were some amazing experiences. Running the Boston Marathon is an experience unlike anything else. There's amazing crowd support. You meet friends along the course. There are all these really positive highlights I have of running that day, including the fact that I have a medal for being a finisher of the Boston Marathon now, which is an amazing accomplishment. But it can be so tempting during these experiences to say, oh, this is horrible. This is the worst thing. And the reality is that when you look back at it, you can see all of these positive moments that happened. And as a marathoner, I'll also say, well, you might be sore the next day. Once you cross that finish line, it kind of stops. Like it's sort of, and then you kind of second guess and think, did I really have to walk at mile 22? I probably could have just kept running. And so I do think that there are a lot of similarities between 2020 and a marathon. I don't think people are wrong from drawing that conclusion.
Are we at mile 22 right now?
I hope so.
Yeah, right.
Although, I'll tell you that another thing they often say about marathons is that you really treat the 20-mile mark like the halfway point. And so I think there's kind of some truth at that too, because even if factually or mathematically we're more than 50% of the way through this, I think the fatigue people are feeling right now is, going to make this last however many miles we have more gut-wrenching perhaps even than those first ones when there was some novelty around what we were doing.
No, that's true. When you think back to 2020, what is some of the good that comes to mind for you?
So one thing that I've said that's been really interesting is I think that being forced to be grounded, to not travel. And you know very well that I am not one of those people that's like, great, this has changed my life. I'm like, how soon can I get back on a plane to travel and go stay at the Marriott Courtyard? I'm like, we've talked to friends who also were on the road a lot, like we both were before this COVID experience. And it seems like it's about 50-50. Some people don't really even want to get back to that type of life. And you and I are different. Yeah,
like we were like, we love to travel. So we're ready. We like airports and hotels. And
I will say, though, that some of the good that has come out of that, though, even though I am eager to get back, to be live, to hug people. I miss hugging people so much. But I have noticed that there are different ways to do things. And sometimes things happen, right? Like it used to be one of my greatest fears that I would be scheduled to be facilitating a session somewhere and I would get snowed in or stuck at an airport in St. Paul or something. And now it's kind of like, all right, if that happens, we all know how to work around this, not just me. I was working with a client the other day on placing somebody and they said, well, it's really important that we find somebody with remote work experience. And it's just been, up to this point when we've done searches, it's been really hard. And the last time they did a search was more than a year ago for this. And I said, well, the good news is everyone has remote work experience.
Everyone now has it. Yeah.
So I think it's a good thing that we've seen some changes and some flexibility, and we've learned how to make things work when we wouldn't have before.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have a favorite from our morning walks, like favorite conversations or things that you've enjoyed from it? I'm going to let people into the personal side.
Really? This was not on the note.
It was not on my list. Well, there's always a surprise question.
Yeah. So, I run the risk of people being like, geez. But my favorite thing on the morning walks, I think, has just been, and you talked about it a little bit in the intro, but it's really that discovery of how aligned our values are and how much you're still my favorite person in the world. And even like, I still want to talk to you. I still find you fascinating and interesting. I still want to hear your perspective on things, even after so many months of being
so many months and hours
in the same place. And so it's not a single conversation, but it is that realization that, gosh, we could have found out things that we weren't excited about finding out. And like you said, probably some people did, but I'm happy that what I found out was that the more sort of challenging issues that we have the opportunity to talk about and address, the more aligned I feel like we are.
Yeah, I agree, which is good. Still ridiculous. It's, to switch it back to work and leadership, not just talking about Jill and Randy. I think it's really seconding what you were saying. I have been so impressed, and I've said it on past episodes of the podcast, but just how adaptable credit unions were this year. We've had so many, I know you've had them, I've had them, so many conversations with different leaders who have just talked about how their entire teams came together and, were able to serve their members and look at the challenges that we're facing. Everyone. To me, that's been so impressive that I can't wait to see what happens next. I find that very exciting. That my personal belief is that so much of what we all have learned this year is going to help us going forward to do better, right? What has you excited, I guess, the most, and that kind of leads right into it for 2021? I think we're all kind of sick of hearing that when we get back to normal, and I just stopped myself from saying it a minute ago. So I'll go with what has you excited about as it feels like at least approaching that opportunity to start to see what our new normal is going to look like. So what has you excited in that new normal, what the world looks like, let's say second half of 2021 or maybe 2022.
So it's a bit of a look into the logistical ninja-ing that I like to do. And so, there's a practice in mindfulness teachings right now that to choose a word for a year and try to meditate on that word. And so about this time last year, I was like, ooh, what's my word going to be for 2020? And I've had, different words, different phrases. And this year I set out with intentional. That was my desire going into 2020 was that I was going to be intentional. And I'm pretty sure I abandoned that somewhere around March 13th, but I did it intentionally. Yeah. I made a conscious decision about what I was doing. And I have actually throughout the year said, okay, I need to stop this. I pride a life by design. You and I both talk about how we can get what we want out of life if we are intentional about it, if we work to craft that. And, we can't kind of just see what happens, but to actually take those steps. And I do feel that in 2020, it's been harder to be intentional about the things I want. So, we've had canceled trips. We've had adjusted expectations. We've thought, that Crosby would have certain opportunities that he didn't end up having because things keep changing. And so it's been a tough year to be intentional. And I am really looking forward to maybe dragging that word back out, dusting it off and trying to use it again so that, and being maybe more mindful of it when I do and really looking at I want to go scuba diving 4 times in 2021 and therefore I will make that happen. And hopefully being in that place where that planning is easier to do. And I guess this is I miss hugging people and I miss making plans that I can actually see through.
Right.
So
yeah.
Those are my 2 things. Bring those back for me. And that's what I'm looking forward
That's
to.
what you're excited about. One of the things that I know you and I have both been grateful for is this little Zoom happy hour we set up at the very beginning of this COVID experience with a group of credit union
I think we thought
friends.
we were going to do 3 of them.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly, I don't think, we're hosting it's either 17 or 18 tomorrow afternoon. The thing to me that's been so amazing about it is the connection that group has been amazing. And to see the friendships grow, many of us all knew each other, but others didn't. And then not only how willing, but how freely people were able to communicate and talk to each other into that group. And then to see the willingness also of others to help maybe somebody who came in with a question or an issue that they were struggling with. And it might not have been what we thought we were going to talk about. And it takes over the whole conversation. It's been so beautiful is the only word that I could come up with. Just the sharing and, what's working and what's not, everything. But that personal connection, you've mentioned hugging, getting out there and seeing people. And I can't wait to see all these, people again in person. And it kind of brings me, to that next question that I wanted for us to kind of talk about. And that was, you mentioned it earlier about the credit union that wanted to make sure that they had remote work experience. That's something that you've become kind of an expert in. This idea that you started Humanity, a human capital firm. Who knew that remote work was going to be such a big part of that a year ago? But, having that healthy, happy, productive side of human capital, is in high demand. Is there something, I guess, as we move forward to next year, there maybe people are spending more time in the office. Maybe they already are right now, but putting that remote work genie back in the bottle, it's not going fully back in.
Right.
That's just not what the world's going to look like. Anything that I guess that you've come up with, anything that you've been sharing with leaders that on how to really take advantage of this kind of more acceptance to remote work?
So for leaders, I think that this is maybe a bit of a wake-up call about what they're actually capable of being able to do to run their organizations, what they can do and still run their organizations. So what is possible? So many times we've heard people say no, and COVID has made people say, we're going to figure it out. And so we've proven to our employees that when push comes to shove, there are things we can figure out. And so those leaders, I think, who can look back on this period and say, all right, we learned lessons there. We're going to take those lessons and we're going to carry them forward to the benefit of our employees. And one of the lessons, hopefully, a lot of leaders have learned is that employees can be trusted. These are adults. These are people who, frankly, most people want to do their best. People don't show up at work for 8 hours a day hoping to do a crappy job. Like, they're going to give the time in, and they want to be productive, and they want to be successful, and they want to do work that they're good at doing. And I think that when an employee employees have said, oh, I want to work remotely. Some people have been skeptical about like, oh, is that because they want to slack off? They don't want somebody looking in at it. And I think what we've learned through COVID is that you can and should trust your people. And if you give them results and manage them to those results, they will rise to that occasion. I think we've also learned that you have got to find room for empathy in the workplace because people are stretched. Like the hours spent at work have expanded. And in this case, work doesn't necessarily mean your job at the credit union. Work means the hours you're spending, honestly, in this case, trying to stay alive. Like, it is work to survive in 2020. And that sounds ridiculous. Like, there's a reason why cavemen didn't have 9-to-5 jobs, right? Like, they were too busy just trying to survive. Now I'm going to say a whole bunch of historically inaccurate things. I don't know what kind of predators there were. Not dinosaurs. I guess we didn't walk the planet at the same time. I don't know. But I hear dragons aren't real. I don't. So, but now we don't spend a lot of time in today's world trying to survive until a global pandemic comes in. And now finding toilet paper is, making sure your child gets educated, keeping your job, not getting COVID. These are all things that are keeping people from being at rest and keeping people from being at leisure. And I think leaders have had to come to understand that and have had to be able to say, like, we can't just look at an employee and say, did you clock in on time? Didn't you clock in on time? We have to be able to say, all right, here's the goal we have to get to. Now let's work together to make sure we can get to that result. And also, what do you need from me in order to be able to get there? And it might be more flexible hours. It might be better communication. It might be a random Tuesday off but being able to let go of some of those previously held sacred cow expectations about you have to be at your desk in order to be working, or you have to get the work done between 9 and 5 in order for it to count. I think I hope that those become changes that last going forward.
So, okay, this is going to be just like our morning walks where you say very insightful stuff and it makes me think about other things that might be completely different rabbit holes. But so 2 things that were popping into my head as I was listening was, number one, like when you said, is it a Tuesday off? It's very tough. Even if you shut off work, there's so much other stuff going on that I think to find that leisure time or find that time away is very difficult because you can't shut it all down. It's tough right now, right? So I don't know if there's a question there, just a comment. But and then the other thing was the connection. Like, we've been remote at CUInsight for many years, and it's something that during COVID, before COVID, that we always struggled with being a remote company was keeping that connection between the entire team. And as more credit unions move into, they're already there, but as that's, maybe as we look into the future in 2021, if there are people that are in the office more, some are still remote, things of that nature. how do you make sure that people aren't just off on an island and feeling left out and not part of the culture that many credit unions have spent so much time to build over the years, that the remote employees or the remote portions, even if it's just remote part-time, part of the time that they're remote, how do you keep that connection and that culture remotely?
Yeah. So that's a struggle. And at the beginning of COVID, I think everybody was like, Zoom happy hours, bring your pet to your Zoom and show us the lake. And I think that worked for a minute at the beginning of it. But now, 9 months in, frankly, 2 months in, we were all like, my eyes hurt from this Zoom. Like, it's not natural to look at a computer screen all day the way we do. So even these kind of early connection points of like, have a Zoom happy hour, just have a Zoom social. What I'm hearing from clients is that they're still getting together by Zoom for staff meetings or, one-on-ones. And now it is get on, get the business done, and get off. We are not chatting on Zoom. We aren't playing trivia games on Zoom. We are all business all the time. And that compares to you walk into the staff meeting, there are some donuts there, people take a few minutes to get their pastry, sit down, chit chat, pass in the hallway, talk about the, child's activities or whatever. So organizations are losing those informal, casual conversation connection points right now that are part of what makes you feel human at work. So I'm hearing from a lot of clients that right now it is all about, we have an agenda, we get our work done, and then we move on. And people are feeling like they're on those islands. So leaders need to be cognizant of that and really look at, how do we make sure we're still being personal and connected without forcing people on more Zoom, which is what people are sort of tired of. And what I'm seeing a lot that's causing people to say, oh, that feels nice, that feels different, is actually sending things in the mail. So I saw an organization that they paid for the restaurant takeout for every employee for Thanksgiving dinner this year. And so not something that would typically happen, right? Normally your organization doesn't care how you spend that holiday, but what a way to send a message that we understand that the world is different this year. We understand that you don't get what you usually get, and let us do something special for you that shows that we get that. Taking the time to actually send a piece of mail to the home or doing something that just gives that additional, like, we still care about you. We know that it's different and we still want to stay connected.
It's a little bit of creativity at this point too.
It does. Yeah. It does. And it takes, I talk a lot about, I'm going to save it because I'm sure you're going to ask me about a book, but there's a concept from, I actually learned it the first time. That's coming up
next. You can go right to it. I'll ask you if there's any.
I learned this concept the first time in one of my college courses in like ethics and communications or something. And it's this idea of the platinum rule. And so the golden rule is treat others as you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat others as they want to be treated. And I think that's the challenge that's on leaders right now. You connect with your team by figuring out what matters to each individual on your team and then treating them that way that they need to be treated in order to feel included. And it's going to be different for everyone, and it's going to take customized relationships too.
That's more of that whole self, I guess. It ties kind of back in, right? So, okay, you mentioned a book. So that's a question that I did plan on keeping in, since a lot of the listeners have come to expect book recommendations from the show. Since the last time you were on, what are you reading? Any good book recommendations that you have for us? I am a couple hours into the 24-hour Audible book that is President Obama's memoir, A Promised Land. So far, it's pretty good. What do you have for us?
So I am, the book that I'm saying, this is your guide, this is what you need. And based on the conversation we've had today, this is absolutely what people need if they're concerned about that. Move from political correctness into authentic inclusion. The book is You Can't Talk About That at Work. It's by Mary Frances Winters, and it is a guide to being able to navigate those conversations about politics and religion. And it was written a few years back, but there, so much stuff that they were talking about, in the wake of the 2016 election and related to political unrest and social injustice. A lot of it is increasingly relevant. It hasn't gone away. We're still dealing with these challenges. And I think that book ends up being a really great handbook and guide for people who are trying to navigate those difficult conversations at work.
As we always do, we'll link to that in the show notes. Thank you again, Jill, for being on the show today. Any final thoughts or asks that you have for our listeners that you'd like to share?
You're welcome for being on the show. There's nowhere else I could go, even if I wanted to, although I do like being with you.
You're kind of held captive right
now. The only final thought or share with the listeners is these may be the most difficult miles of this marathon we're on. They are the hardest, but we are closer to the finish line and we will get to the other side and there will be hugs there. So
there will be hugs. Lots of hugs. You're ready. Jill's going to have a booth. A hugging booth. I thank you again. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I'd have some news to share about the podcast. We are retooling over the next couple weeks. In 2021, the CUInsight Experience will be moving to every other week. You can still expect to hear from the who's who of credit unions, and the episodes will be probably even more packed with leadership lessons learned. I have been putting together a new list of questions to dig even deeper, get even greater insight from our guests. We'll also be launching the CUInsight Network in 2021. This will be a standalone podcast that will be every other week, also on the off weeks of the CUInsight Experience. The focus here of that podcast is going to be taking an issue that's facing credit unions and bringing people in from our network at CUInsight, those subject matter experts, to offer solutions and best practices to help move credit unions forward. We're already lining up some amazing guests for that one and going to be, hitting those topics that are most important to credit unions today. The goal of the network will be to, tackle those complex issues in under 30 minutes or less. So stay tuned for that. That's it for the 2020 CUInsight Experience. Thank you again, Jill, my love, for hanging out with me today and through all of this crazy year. Thank you to Trellance, PSCU, and Co-op Financial Services for sponsoring the podcast this year. And most of all, thank you to all of you for letting me have this much fun doing what I do. Happy holidays, friends. Stay well, and see you in 2021.